This week, we're going to be looking at sort of an introduction and background to environmental politics. And we've got some big questions for the week. What is environmental policy and what is environmental politics? How have major events affected the environment and environmental policy? What is NEPA? And what is climate change? And sort of as an aside to that, is it happening and what's the consensus on that? Now, this week, you're going to have a couple readings and videos that are going to help get at those answers. So one of them is made by yours truly, and it's going to talk a lot about what is policy, what is politics, what's the environment, and how those things fit together for the purposes of our course. And you'll see that on our summary document as well as in the video I filmed about it. We also have a great video that's going to help explain NEPA. That's the National Environmental Protection Act. And that act was one of the really big foundational pieces of environmental legislation in the US and has laid a lot of the groundwork for our country's environmental policy. So it's important to know what that is, and that video is going to give you a really nice, quick overview of it. We then have two readings. One is a timeline put together by to sort of accompany a PBS documentary on environmental policy and politics in the US. And you'll see that that timeline has a really good outline of major events in the environmental movement. So what's great about that timeline is it has some of the major laws that have passed, but it also has some big events that may have helped trigger a law being passed, some environmental crises, but also some other things that are related, but maybe a little less directly than you'd initially think. So, for example, advances in our space program. So I encourage you to read that and continue referring back to it throughout the semester, because that's going to be a great place for you to go when you're like, wait, how does this fit in? When did this happen? Knowing sort of chronologically when things happened can help us understand why they happened at the sort of rate they happened, right? And why one thing happened after the other. Right? NEPA, I said, laid a lot of groundwork. So if we know something actually was being discussed before NEPA, we know it's being discussed in a very different environment, or I should say context, than something that's being discussed after NEPA. So keeping that timeline in mind throughout the semester will be very helpful. Finally, we have a little document from the EPA on climate change, and it has some really great videos embedded in it. So if you prefer to watch and listen rather than read, you should be able to get what you need from the videos. If you prefer to read, you should be able to get what you need from the reading and skip those videos. The basic idea is to give you a really, really quick primer on climate change. Now, climate change is something we're going to be discussing later this semester, but it's worth sort of getting that basic science in there now, as some of the topics we discussed before we really get to climate change will have bearing on climate change. So it's worth just having a foundation in that science. Now, if you know a decent amount about this already, you should probably be good with just that little refresher. But if you don't know much, I encourage you to click around that website. I've given you the link to the basics page, but there's also a good discussion about the causes and consequences of climate change on that same website. And there's a nice FAQ there as well. And those are all put on by the EPA, so we know they're pretty reliable. Now, I had said one of our big questions was, is there some consensus on whether climate change is happening? And that's something we're going to look at later this semester, but I encourage you to check out the optional Orestes reading, which talks a lot about that. Talks about what the consensus is and touches on why it might not be obvious that there's a consensus. Now, that reading we'll revisit later in the semester, so if you don't have the time your first week of classes to get to that, that's okay. It is optional at the moment, but I do encourage you to at least skim it. It's pretty short. And again, it's just going to help lay the groundwork for some stuff we're doing later this semester. So that's our big takeaway for the week, is that we're going to be really laying the groundwork and giving this sort of background for what we're learning this semester.